You're listening to the Visible Expert Podcast, where we share stories, research, and actionable insights to help B2B marketers and practitioners drive extraordinary growth in their professional lives. All right, thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Visible Expert Podcast. I'm John Tyerman.
And I'm Kelly Waffle.
Today we have Scott McKain as our guest today, and he helps organizations create distinction in every phase of their business. He is an internationally recognized expert and has been honored into the Professional Speakers Hall of Fame. Scott McKain. So, Kelly, what did you think of our chat with Scott?
I was taking notes the whole time. It was just...
He's an excellent speaker, I will say.
Phenomenal speaking voice, as you'll hear in the podcast, so stay tuned for that. I thought he brought up a really cool point around the reservoir of goodwill and how that's really important if you're going to leverage that to become a differentiation point and to move up to a level of distinction or even to become iconic. You have to have that reservoir of goodwill to make those things happen. And he gives some good examples that people can relate to in the podcast. What did you like, John?
Well, I did, differentiation is definitely a challenge that's facing our audience. So I thought that his 5 factors of achieving distinction were very, very well taken. And so tune in for that. I also like that, as a 14-year-old, his first job was at a local radio station. I thought that was a very good story, and he's a podcaster, and I listened to his podcast, Distinction, or Project Distinct. So check that out, subscribe, listen to some episodes of that. So I'm really excited to share this interview with our audience.
Yeah, he brought up some good stuff that I think, people really need to embed into their brain. It's really around the concept of promise and performance. Mm-hmm. And if you don't get anything else out of the podcast, please take what Scott says in here to heart, because that will be a key part for your company to grow in the near future.
Spoiler alert.
Sorry.
Don't.
You're spoiling.
I'm spoiling.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't underpromise and overdeliver.
Ah.
So that may be a common adage, but Scott is against that. So you'll have to listen to his thoughts about that. But first, a word from our sponsor. So this episode is sponsored by the Hinge Research Institute. So if you're involved in marketing or demand or lead generation and want to use a data-driven approach to content strategy, consider using Original Research. The Hinge Research Institute offers a range of services from tiered sponsorships of original studies to custom research on specific industry challenges. And we found that high-growth professional services firms are 3 times more likely than no-growth firms to using original research in their content strategy. And, according to Forbes, companies who adopt a data-driven approach to marketing are 6 times more likely to be profitable year over year. If you're interested in learning more, email us at research@hingemarketing.com, and we'll find the right approach to using original research for you. All right, well, on that note, let's dive right into our interview with Scott. Our guest today helps organizations create distinction in every aspect of their business and teaches the ultimate customer experience. An internationally recognized expert, he has been honored with introductions to the Professional Speakers Hall of Fame. Mr. Scott McKain, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, John. Kelly, great to join you as well. Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've been out there traveling and doing a lot of speaking and events, so it's great to connect with you.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's been very busy, and I'm very, very grateful for that, to the organizations and associations and everything that bring me in to speak or to read the books, or as you well know. I mean, it's a privilege to have the chance to serve and to spread the message of what it takes to stand out. So and that's what you folks are doing as well, in terms of how do you differentiate yourself in the competition in this hyper competitive world we live in. So that's what it's all about.
That's terrific. So following up on that, Scott, here at Hinge, we really define influencers in the B2B space as those who share their expertise as visible experts. So in this podcast, we focus on sharing the stories of our guests and really illuminating their journey to building a personal brand. So, Scott, in the next couple of minutes, can you really tell us a little bit about your journey?
Sure, I appreciate you asking, Kelly. I started out very young in this. I was fortunate enough to be a state president and national officer of a student organization, which meant that I took a couple of years off of college to do nothing but travel and speak, and gave 1,000 free speeches during those couple of years. And so because of that, you practice enough, hopefully you get a little better. And I was speaking mostly to students, but the parents would hear me and ask me to come back and, give my little speech. Mom was the president of some bank, or somebody's dad had an insurance agency or whatever. So they'd ask me to come back and speak. So I paid my way through college doing that. And I graduated from college, and I took a job with the school. But I kept getting all these invitations to speak. And so I either had to get in or get out. So I decided to speak, and I carved out a pretty decent career, but I have to admit, I was a generic. I mean, if somebody wanted a time management program, I could research, and, because of the ability that I had developed for giving those free speeches and those few paid speeches in the early days, I could do a good job with that. If they wanted stress management, goal setting skills, whatever. And like I said, I built a pretty decent career doing that. But then, sadly, unfortunately, my wife developed ovarian cancer, and I had to pretty much shut down the business and be the caregiver. And after she passed away, I'm broke from healthcare bills. I'm alone, depressed. My calendar's empty, and I got to get to work. And when I tell that story, I joke, and that concludes the motivational part of my message for today. I was just, I was in deep. And so one of the things that I did was to call speakers bureaus, and speakers bureaus book speakers. They're kind of like a travel agency is for the airlines. They book speakers at meetings and conferences and events. So I would call them and I'd say, okay, when you recommend me, what do you say about me? And their answer was a good speaker and a really nice guy. Well, I want to be a good speaker, and I think being nice is a choice, and I choose to do that, but that's the kiss of death. I mean, no one ever buys a product simply because, you're good at what you do and you're nice. I mean, the vice president of sales at Ford was not going to say, hey, for this year's sales meeting, let's get a really nice guy. You want somebody that can teach your people how to do something specific. So I thought, I have to learn how to separate what I do from what all of these myriad of other folks, thousands of other speakers out there in the marketplace do. So I started to research, what did it take to create not just differentiation. To me, part of how I looked at it was this: if I slapped every customer in the face, I'm different. but it doesn't mean that customer is going to come back and buy anything more from me. So it had to be differentiation that had traction and meaning to my customers. And I use the term distinction for that. So I started researching that for my own business. And then in the blinding flash of the obvious, I realized that, maybe there's a lot of other businesses that are looking for this as well. So about 11 years ago, I wrote a book called Collapse of Distinction. I was really fortunate that 30 major newspapers like the Miami Herald and New Orleans Times-Picayune said it was one of the 10 best business books of the year. And that was a huge break for me. I started speaking about distinction. And for the last, over 10 years, I've really been focused on what does it take to stand out in a hyper-competitive marketplace? And it's given me also the opportunity to go deeper into that subject, because I've had the chance to develop case studies of businesses large and small that have applied these principles and have been able to really make significant gains in their respective marketplaces because of it. And at the end of the day, it's just applying. Do you imagine that, walking the talk? Trying to practice what you preach. But as the marketplace changes and as competition gets more difficult, we always have to be tweaking and revising and improving. And that's what I'm trying to do in my business and what I'm trying to help other businesses do. And it has helped me, make sense of the personal tragedy that I went through. And it's also helped me to help other people to grow their businesses, both large and small. And that has just been the greatest joy of my life.
Well, that's, you make an interesting point in taking it a step further, for it's not just differentiation, but it's creating distinction. And we found in our own ongoing research that differentiation is the number one marketing priority of high growth professional services firms. So there's definitely something there. In your book, Iconic, you contend that merely standing out from your competition isn't enough to take your brand and business to the highest level. And so how do you become an iconic organization or leader?
John, the problem with me defining this is I always feel like I sound like my logic professor in college, that one of these things is not like the other. So distinction to me means that you are recognized within your industry, within your marketplace as being unique. To me, iconic performers are those that even transcend their own industry. So you might have a little local coffee shop that really stands out and a lot of people go there. But Starbucks in that field is iconic. They're not limited to their own industry. Mm-hmm. There is but it doesn't have to be just a big business. There is a steakhouse in Indianapolis that has higher revenue than places like Tavern on the Green in New York City because they become iconic. They are the business, not that just other restaurants, but that every business in the city of Indianapolis would like to be like. So it is really taking your business to the highest level of distinction. And that's what I tried to do in the book. And what happened was one of my clients that had been through the distinction process that I outlined in Collapse to Distinction and Create Distinction, they followed that and they attained pretty remarkable results. And they said, what's next? And honestly, it never occurred to me. It had never occurred to me that once you'd gotten there, how do you sustain it? Or if you've lost it, how do you get it back? I mean, we've seen a lot of businesses that used to be distinctive and that has eroded from them over the past year. So can you get it back? And if so, what do you do to reestablish yourself in that position? So that's really what I researched for Iconic is how do you transcend your own category? How do you attain that ultimate level of distinction? And how do you keep it? And if you lose it, how do you get it back?
So what'd you find?
Well, I found, first of all, when it comes to getting it back, that part of it depends on what I call the reservoir of goodwill that you've established. If there's enough goodwill out there for you in the marketplace that customers are still interested to see what your next act is, you have a great chance. If your demise was caused by the alienation of your customers, it doesn't matter how much backing you have, you're going to have a hard time getting it back. There are some businesses, for example, United Airlines is a client. And one of the things that I said is, they've got to get their ship right internally before they can go out to the marketplace and say, fly the friendly skies. What I love is that their internal management recognizes that and realizes that and are making some really incredible strides. But it is like turning the ship around in the ocean. It's hard to get it moved with that many employees, and particularly when you have other folks that are wearing your name badge with affiliated companies like the commuter airlines do. So, but there was a reservoir of goodwill with people with United. Many do remember when it was the friendly skies or taking their first flight. So they have a chance. Circuit City has no chance because they alienated their customers by the erosion of the performance that they were delivering for them.
Right. Exactly.
They went on the death spiral of, cutting employees to help. So you go in, you couldn't find anybody to wait on you. You couldn't get anybody to help you. The stores weren't, well stocked and clean by the end of their run. So I don't think there's a reservoir of goodwill left for Circuit City or a company or Sears, even, as we're seeing now, to come back simply because they've alienated so many of us. We don't care what they do next. In terms of what do you do to move to the next level, I found some surprising things. There were 5 factors of iconic performance that I found. And the first one is that iconic organizations play offense. It was really interesting. I'm a sports fan. I always heard that playing defense was the way that the defense wins championships is the old adage. But if you look at the statistics, it's not true. What happens is that if you look at the NFL statistics, for example, most of the Super Bowl champions have had the better offense, not defense. The better offense has won more NFL playoff games. So it's the better offense that tends to win. So by playing offense, it means that we have competitive knowledge and information, but we don't allow that to define how we're going to play our game. And there's an example in the book of the Fairmont Scottsdale Princess who really originated this idea for me about being iconic through my work with them. And what they did to chart their own path in terms of saying, we're going to own Christmas in the desert. And now they have tens of hundreds of thousands of people that attend their Christmas ceremonies. They're at this hotel in the desert in the time that formerly was one of their worst occupancy rates. Now it's become more, you can't even get a room there because people want their families to stay there when they visit. People want to visit. They want to spend a couple of, it's just amazing what they've done. Now they own the holiday in the desert. The second one was get promise and performance right. What happens is we've ignored the fact that customers only evaluate us on two variables. And that's what did we promise them that we would do? And then how did we perform based upon that promise? That's it. Did we do what we said we would do when we said we would do it? And that creates 4 different types of organizations based upon whether your promise is either low or high and whether your performance is low or high. But what we find is iconic companies are advancing their promise as they accelerate their performance. In other words, the promise continues to grow. What they can do for customers, they continue to enhance that. But they don't just do that. They accelerate their performance so they continue to deliver at a high level for their customers. By the way, one of the most interesting things that I found in the research was this. The old adage about under-promise and over-deliver does not gain us traction with customers. Customers eventually begin to feel like we are manipulating the promise so we can make ourselves the hero with the performance, not out of a desire to serve their unique and specific needs. That was a big shock. Third factor is stop selling. Look, I realize that we all have to sell. We all have to close deals to keep our doors open. But iconic organizations focus on creating experiences that customers want to repeat and refer, while the basic organizations are just out there focusing on transactions. And as we move from a transactional to a subscription economy, the whole thing about keeping customers more engaged and not making them feel like their arms are being twisted to close a deal becomes even more important than ever before. Fourth one was a shock too. It's go negative. Iconic organizations, I found, were infinitely more willing to pursue the negative. They didn't confuse. See, in a lot of organizations, what we find is if somebody brings this negative information, we assume the employee is negative. That's not true in iconic companies. What they get very diligent about going as deeply as they can to find out what's wrong. Average companies, if there's a problem, they placate the customer so the customer feels better. Iconic companies go deeper and they fix the process so they don't continue to create these dissatisfied customers. And the fifth one is a cultural thing. It's internal. It's reciprocal respect. It's that the leaders of the organization extend as much respect to their frontline people as they expect their frontline people to extend to them. So they create cultures of respect in every way so that the people on the team have a desire to serve customers and to create those experiences that they want to refer and repeat.
That's great. I'm just taking notes here. Those 5 factors were fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks. It's been a lot of fun to see how organizations use those and how they vary them. For example, one of the things that Kelly, that came up in the research was a finding at the University of Texas on SWOT analysis and how so many organizations were afraid to examine the negative, that even bad things that you normally put as a weakness or a threat were placed as opportunities. If they had a bad brand image, many times they would say, that's an opportunity because we can improve it. Well, no, it's a weakness that you need to improve. You need to get folks like you to help us to get our brand image where it needs to be. It's a threat. It's a weakness. And iconic organizations were willing to identify their weaknesses and call them out as that, and not just try to paper them over and sing Kumbaya and say it was a wonderful opportunity.
That's great. Scott, in professional services, many growing companies are reliant on their experts to both develop business and deliver for their clients. From your perspective, how can seller doers in this model deliver an exceptional client experience?
That's a great question, because part of what the research pointed out was that the seller doers are in many cases in a stronger situation than we've realized. In some organizations where the professional that sells is not the professional that executes, we find that the promise and performance is not congruent. So they'll promise what they need to promise to get the transaction, and then turn it over to somebody else to make certain that they do it. And so now we've got the perception of the customer of what was promised and the perception of the doer of what is going to be accomplished. And the customer, the doer does everything that she possibly can, that she's supposed to do. And somehow the customer is still dissatisfied. Why? Because there's a disconnection between promise and performance, between who made the promise and who's in charge of the execution. So as you point out, in professional service firms where the person who makes the promise is also the person that has to follow up, there's a greater chance of congruency there. And so the ultimate customer experience is found in many cases, and this is part of what's shocking, I think, about this, is when we do what we said we would do when we said we would do it. When we take full accountability and we provide the customer exactly what we promised in exactly the time frame that we've promised, and we do everything that we can to fulfill their expectations. Now, naturally, all of us in business like doing these little extra things, the handwritten thank you card or any little gift or all those. And I'm all for that because we haven't promised that at the onset. It's not a part of the promise. So doing these things to enhance the experience, they're absolutely vital to creating an ultimate customer experience. But the fundamental thing that the fundamental aspect of what folks that you ask about, Kelly, can do is to make certain that they record and are very precise about what's been promised. So the perception of the customer about the promise is the same as the organization, as the salesperson's. And then that salesperson who is also the doer then sets out to execute exactly what the customer perceives has been promised and deliver it on exactly that time frame.
Yeah, that's one of the brand attributes that we've identified is how good is an organization at doing what they say they will do? How good are they at delivering on their promises? So that's really helpful to hear you say that too. So I think that's really, really helpful to validate that.
Well, what we end up with, John, is we end up with 4 different styles here, and one is the laggard. At least the laggard tells the truth, right? It's low promise, low performance. They don't promise much, they don't deliver much, and they don't get much business. They get by. But then you get the high promise, low performance, and that's a fraud. And there's no nice way to say that, nor should there be, because these are the folks that will promise anything to get your business. And then once they get your business, then they don't deliver. They never really planned on delivering. It's everything from a big business to the waiter who says, the specials tonight are fantastic, but they're not. He's just been told to push them. Then you get the best group, I think, is the disruptors. That's the high promise and high performance. The genesis of all disruption is dissatisfaction. And so when we can find ways to keep our customers engaged and we advance the promise as we advance the performance, man, that's the place to be, right? I mean, that's where we want to be. As I mentioned earlier, the low promise, high performance, those are the manipulators. Those are the ones that's, saying they're sandbagging the promise so they can overcome that with the performance. But it's not to serve the customer. It's really make themselves look like a hero. It's based on the organization or the person or the professional, not on the customer. And so when we look at that, we realize that doing what we said we would do when we said we would do it, setting high goals in terms of our promise, but just as high in terms of our performance, when we make that congruent, that's an essential part of standing out in today's marketplace.
Yeah, it's like you're aligning the expectations, you're being transparent, you're being authentic, and I think that really goes a long way, no matter what business you're in. So,
well, you're so right there too, Kelly. I mean, that was part of what was so interesting in the research is that what you just said right there works for whether you are Apple or whether you are that steakhouse in Indianapolis. It works. I did work with a microbrewery, a craft brewery here in Las Vegas. And that applied to them just as strongly as it applied to all the Fairmont hotels in the world. And that whole important aspect of being transparent and being sincere and caring about your customer. We hear about that so much, but part of why we hear about it so much is so few are really executing just on that. Mm-hmm. That by simply being congruent, it's amazing how it makes us stand out.
Yeah, it's like they're leaving opportunities on the table. So, hey, Scott, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and, talking about being congruent and authentic. You're very engaged and authentic on social media. And
thank you.
I heard I think I was first introduced to you. I heard an interview with you on the B2B Growth Show, which is a great podcast. And then I started listening to your Project Distinct podcast
thank you.
months ago. And then we connected on Twitter and LinkedIn. We continued the conversation there. And now we're on a podcast together. So
I love it.
Yeah, to me, it feels like social media is really the connective tissue in that flow of interaction. What role do you think social media will play in businesses, particularly in B2B in the future?
Harvard recently wrote that the fundamental change in B2B is that it's become so much more like B2C. And even if I'm selling and working with or marketing to a corporation, really it's the individuals who are the decision makers that I need to be connected with. We've good grief, when I went to a sales training course in the 80s, and one of the things they said then, I was just getting started, and they said, people do business with people they like. Well, I think that's still true, whether it's B2B or B2C. I mean, my best corporate customers, the ones that I'm on retainer with and use me many times a year, those folks have grown to be friends. And they were clients first and became friends, but the engagement factor is extraordinarily high. And John, I think you've hit on something absolutely critical that people forget. It's called social media for a reason. Yeah. My buddy Chris Brogan has this great quote about Twitter is dangerously close to becoming bots talking to bots. And I've had people say, "Oh, Scott, you shouldn't put pictures of your dog on social media, or you shouldn't talk about what movie you just saw that you liked on social media. You should separate business and personal." But I've found that I've attracted more people to do business with me because they feel like they know me even before we have connected, if that makes sense. And I get engaged with social media where it feels social. It feels like a sincere conversation. And the brands that I think do best at that reveal, it's not just, hey, look at our special today, but it's things about the people. I mentioned United earlier. I think one of the things where United is doing very, very well right now is if you look at their social media, it's fun things about pilots and flight attendants and the people that work for United Airlines. And I just think that's so important. That's the kind of person that I want to be, not just the kind of business I want to be. It's the kind of person I want to be transparent and to engage. And I think many organizations focus on the media part and not the social part of social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. I think every time I think of United, I think of that one YouTube video, United Breaks Guitars. So for whatever reason, it always sticks out in my mind. But
well, and that, it's interesting because they've even booked him to come speak to them now. The new leadership at United, Dave Carroll is his name, and he's a Canadian speaker, songwriter, singer, and they have even booked him to come speak to them now. Which I think is absolutely you would think the last group in the world that will want him to speak to their people would be United Airlines, and they've brought him in to talk to him. And I think that's what we have to do. That's just part of this. It's fascinating to me. I did a program a while back, and it was for a group of surgeons, and I was the first non-surgeon to ever keynote the meeting. And one of the things I found out was you can graduate from medical school, become a doctor, go through your internships and residency, and never take a single course on bedside manner, on how you communicate with a patient. And I was shocked, and I was telling people about that and using that a little bit in my speech. And then I had somebody come up with the speech and say, I have an MBA and never took a course on the customer experience. And I wonder, have we trained, educated a generation of leaders that know how to read balance sheets and P&L statements and can quote their EBITDA, but don't have a real sincere understanding of the importance of the customer experience. Because I think the purpose of business is to properly create experiences that are so compelling to customers that their loyalty becomes assured. If I can create experiences that make customers come back repeatedly and refer my business to their friends, I got to agree. If I'm doing that profitably, I can't fail. That's a great business. Yet we've trained this generation of leaders that focus so much on the metrics. But the cover of the new Harvard Business Review is metrics running your business, right? I mean, we've got to get to the point that we think about these experiences and what really ignites passion and engagement with customers. And we're missing that in so many organizations.
Yeah, that experience is really the new currency, at least for marketing. I also liked what you said earlier, which I think plays to this point, is folks shouldn't just keep doing things the way that they've been doing things in the past. They should always be tweaking, revising, improving, looking to optimize all of these things as they move forward.
It's so true. I mean, the organizations, I saw a great quote today by the CEO of UPS, and Fortune magazine asked him, "Are you worried about FedEx?" And he said, the big players, we kind of know where they are and what they're doing. He says, I worry more in today's world of technology about somebody in their garage creating something that disrupts us that we didn't see coming. We have to keep thinking and acting like entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. Man, I love that. Now, their execution, we'll see. The jury is out. But that's the kind, we got to change our thinking about this.
Right.
And typically what's happened is, it's the Clayton Christensen work on the innovator's dilemma, is that once we create something that's successful, we try to do everything we can to extend and to protect the life cycle of that idea, that invention, that product, that service. But instead, what we need to be doing is worrying more about who's going to disrupt. The genesis of disruption is dissatisfaction. So the more that we can keep our customer engaged, the less likely we are to be disrupted, because we're not creating this area of dissatisfaction, either conscious or unconscious, in our customers.
Hey, Scott, we've identified 3 skills that experts should be focusing on to become more visible. One of them is writing. Another that you've kind of touched on is networking. And a third that you're very familiar with is speaking. So, Scott, you've been honored with the induction into the Professional Speakers Hall of Fame. What advice would you give to a professional looking to take their personal brand a little bit further?
Wow, that's a great question, Kelly. I was reminded of this. I wrote this in one of my early books, and honestly, I'd kind of forgotten about it until somebody reminded me of it here at a meeting not long ago. In 1950, they did a survey of futurists, and they asked the world's leading futurist what was the most important skill you could have for the second half of the 20th century. And they said the ability to develop, to understand, and implement technological solutions. Well, if you look what happened between 1950 and 2000, it was spot on, right? I mean, that was the most important skill you could possess. So in 2000, they did it again. They asked the world's leading futurist, what's the most important skill a professional can have? And the answer was the ability to create and relate stories. And if you look at the 3 items you just said in terms of writing and speaking and networking, it is the ability to create and relate narrative that's engaging. I think a lot of people work on their speaking first, which would almost be like in movies if we picked a cast and leased the cameras and built the sets and hired a director and got everybody together and said, okay, now what's the movie about? Right? I mean, you don't do that. You start with a script. You start with something to say. And that's why I think what you're saying in terms of writing is so critical, because if your speaking ability is moderate, but you have a compelling story, people are going to listen. If you don't have a compelling story and your ability to speak and the gift of gab is great, you might be okay for a while, but eventually people are going to see through that. So what you're saying about writing and then networking and then speaking is critically important. The other thing I'd say too is just a reminder that, I gave 1,000 free speeches before I got paid for the first one. And I had a great opportunity because of my student organization. You don't have to give 1,000 speeches, but there's nothing that is better than getting time on stage. Speakers speak, right? I mean, if you're going to be a speaker, you got to get out there and do it. So whether it's joining Toastmasters or whether it's donating your time for a charity, whatever it is, it's a craft, it's a talent, it's a skill, like any sporting event or any music, concert. It is a skill that is learned and acquired. Some people have more natural talent than others, but really the differentiating factor is how much are you willing to work on it to improve, to develop your abilities to the best you can. Get coaching. I've had the privilege of coaching some really interesting people. I coached one of the authors of the book Freakonomics. I coached the real life Captain Phillips. I coached some really, really interesting folks in terms of helping develop their speaking style and speaking abilities. And I have a speech coach. Michael Jordan had a basketball coach all his career, right? So get a coach to help you. And there's a lot of resources out there to help you develop that. But the ability to create and relay stories, I believe, is the single most important quality that any professional can possess in today's marketplace.
Scott, we just have a couple more questions for you. I know we're running close on time here, but
no, that's fine. That's great. That's great.
On your podcast, Project Distinct, you do tell a lot of stories, and I find myself listening and captivated by your stories. I think you're a wonderful storyteller. But what's your experience specifically with your podcast, and why do you choose to focus on that as a channel?
It's kind of it's a great question, John, and it's a strange answer. But when I was 14 years old, I got my first job outside of my family's grocery store in small town Crothersville, Indiana, and it was working for the little local radio station just a few miles south. And it wasn't because I had a good voice or anything like that. It was because my dad owned a grocery store, and they thought if they hired his kid, he'd buy more commercials. So there was this program that I had to play every day, though, and it was called Our Changing World by Earl Nightingale. And it was just a 5 to 7 minute program of Earl Nightingale telling a story about what you could do to have personal and professional development. And at 14, I would sit there, and that was to me more interesting than the records. That's what we played at the time, was records, right? And I would sit there and take notes. And so that's why my podcast is a little bit different. It's just a 6 to 10 minute daily, 7 day a week, just story and idea about what you can do. And so that's what I took that from, because that simple radio program had such an impact on me at a young age. I just thought, well, I talk about differentiation and distinction. I want to do something a little bit different. And that was just my idea, is just to give everybody a daily idea. And it's what happens again, John, to your point, is it's an important channel, because what happens is if people are interested in the stories in the podcast, then maybe they'll want to read my books, or maybe they'll want to book me for a speech, or, hey, maybe they'll even want to have me on their podcast like you're doing right now. So I found it a very, very important channel to connect with people. Being an old radio person from my teens, I wish they wouldn't have named it podcast. It's really on-demand radio. Is what it is. It's the ability to program what we listen to just as much as we're able to make choices about what we watch via Netflix or Hulu or whatever. And that it's just fantastic when you think about what podcasts can do as a tool to help us connect in a way that we've never had before, in our ability to not only reach out with our information and our material, but to transcend that so that people get a feel of who and what we are and can either relate to us or engage with us or whatever because of that. So to your point, I think it's an incredibly important tool, and one that I think is even going to grow and grow in popularity in the future.
Scott, I just have one more question for you, and this is kind of a personal favor on my end.
Sure.
Can you say the phrase 2 balls and 1 strike?
Oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I love the show, and I'm absolutely drawing a blank on his name right now. Do you watch the show on IFC? It's Hank Azaria.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like him all Brockmeyer.
Brockmeyer, that's it. He's a sports guy.
Oh man, you're talking about my goal in life. Oh my goodness, I wanted to be the play-by-play guy for the Chicago White Sox. I thought that would just be the ultimate job in life.
That would be heaven, yes. But
Two balls, one strike.
There it is. All right. Thank you.
I would. Oh man, just to travel around and sit and watch baseball and talk about. Oh, sign me up. Where and isn't that funny? We all have our ultimate dream jobs. I had the greatest side gig in the world when I was first starting my speaking business. I was a movie reviewer. I was syndicated to 100 TV stations across the United States, and because of that, then I got to go to the junkets and interview stars, and I had the privilege of talking to just about every celebrity you can imagine. And the funny thing was, you'd sit and talk to these movie stars, and they all wanted to be rock stars. And the rock stars I've met, they want to be in movies. So,
right,
no matter what it is, I think we have this other career that we think would be fantastic. But the truly important thing is for us to create distinction where we're planted, to do our best and to stand out where we are.
I couldn't agree more, and I've gotten a lot out of this podcast today, so I really thank you for making the time to join us.
My privilege. I really appreciate the invitation, and thank you so much. I love you folks have had some great guests, and I love your podcast, and I really appreciate the chance to be a guest on it, because it's been the quickest half hour of my life. It's really been great. Thank you for being so engaging.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for coming on. And again, for those that are listening, check out Project Distinct, Scott's podcast. And Scott, if you want people to connect with you online, where should they go?
Oh, I appreciate you asking. Thanks, John. It's just Scott McKain on Twitter, SCOTT, and my last name is spelled MCKAIN, just Scott McKain on Twitter, or it's scottmckain.com. You can connect to my blog, my podcast there on that site, or anything about the books and speeches. If they'd like more information on that, it's all right there.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I loved it. Thank you.
And that was our chat with Scott McKain. So check him out at scottmckain.com. Subscribe to his podcast, Project Distinct. And if you found this podcast valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe. You can do that by going on to your Apple Podcasts, if you're an Apple Podcast listener, and going up to the search bar, search for The Visible Expert, scroll on down to the bottom, and leave us a rating and review. It will really help. Kelly, any last words before we say goodbye to our listeners?
I just love the little baseball thing he did at the end. That really made my day.
2 balls, 1 strike.
That's another one of my favorites, is John Tyerman. They rank number 1 and number 2.
Well, thank you, Kelly. I appreciate that. All right, everybody. Well, we will see you next week. So this is John and Kelly signing off. Have a great week.